Hello, welcome back everyone. Today we're going to begin our series on the Gothic novel with the first Gothic novel ever. Good place to start. Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto. So here we go again. The lightsabers aren't lit today because it's iced tea, but I got a comment on this mug, so thanks. I love this thing. Alright, I promised to review the Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. I have the new edition that I bought that I showed you guys in my TBR, and I did search for my other edition, which I vaguely remember having a different cover and a different introduction, but also being by Oxford. Couldn't find it, so we're just going off of this one without a comparison of the two. But the introductory material in this was great. It was written by this guy, Nick Groom, who has also written some books on the Gothic and has done some other introductions for Oxford World Classics. Not too familiar with his work, but I think that I might soon be. I think I might order that very short introduction series on the Gothic. That's a very good series from also from Oxford University Press. If you guys have ever seen them, they have them on tons of topics, and I think that you could have just like a very broad-based education if you read nothing but just like a very short introduction to a bunch of different topics. I think there's like hundreds of titles in that series, so I might read the one on the Gothic. But the introductory materials that Nick Groom wrote for this book were really good. They helped put this story into a lot of context, and there's a lot of story behind the story with Castle of Otranto. So there's kind of like, what's its literary significance, and then is the book any good? And I kind of want to discuss those as two separate things. Because this book is originally written 1764, published by a very young man, Horace Walpole. He was in his 20s, but he was actually already in Parliament. That actually becomes like a running trend in some of these early Gothic books. They're written by young English or British men, who a lot of whom seem to be in their 20s and also in Parliament. Horace Walpole had a Gothic-like estate that inspired the book, Strawberry Hills, which he reimagined from its original architectural style into like this neo-Gothic, faux Gothic edifice that he built around it. And then when he wrote his book, he tried to create like a literary version of the Gothic. Now, to him, what he was trying to do, and what he states in the preface to the second edition, is he was trying to fuse two different genres, which was like the modern novel, which was emerging at the time, with like the romantic epics and tales from the medieval period. In the first edition of this book, when it first came out in 1764, he actually claimed that it was just a medieval story that had been discovered and that he had translated it anonymously into English. The next year, in 1765, he came out with the second edition. The second edition is important for a lot of reasons. One, he owns up to the fact that he, Horace Walpole, was the author. Two, he fesses up that it was not a translation, but it's actually an original work of fiction on his. Three, he changed the name from just the Castle of Otranto to the Castle of Otranto, a Gothic story, which it hadn't been labeled in the original edition. And in the preface to the second edition, he also kind of lays out a manifesto. And his manifesto talks about the fusion of those two genres and how he was trying to take the more realistic, psychologically realistic maybe, genre of the modern novel, but still have some of the adventure and romance and fantastic things that were in the medieval time period. Part of this relates to how Shakespeare was viewed at the time, because Shakespeare has ghosts and witches and supernatural events in his stories, but he's like canonically like the greatest writer in English language. But at the time in the 1700s, writing stories that had supernatural elements was not considered like a modern or proper thing to do. Shakespeare got it passed because he was Shakespeare. So a lot of the supernatural elements in Castle of Otranto kind of partake like of that scene from like Hamlet and things with ghosts, and other parts do not. Other parts are kind of wildly imaginative. There's like a giant suit of armor which keeps appearing in the castle in various parts. A giant helm comes down and crushes someone. A giant hand comes out and chases some servants. People show up with a gigantic sword that has to be carried by 100 men, and it's quite ridiculous. And we'll talk in another video coming up about how other authors and readers at the time also thought it was ridiculous and critiqued what Horace Walpole set out. But Horace Walpole, I give him a lot of credit and a lot of respect in that he was conscientiously trying to create a new genre and doing something very experimental with his writing at a young age, and he was incredibly successful. It was a best-selling book and widely influential, and is now considered by scholars widely to be the first Gothic novel. So in his first kind of major literary attempt, he hit like a home run. Whatever criticisms that he got at the time for, kind of doing this thing where, oh, this is a translation that I found, oh no, it's actually my story. It's like a little bit like the Blair Witch Project of the 1760s. But he was really trailblazing in what he did, and so I give him a lot of respect and a lot of credit. Now, how do things shape up if you read this book as a modern reader? Not that well. So if you were to think of what we think of as like Gothic now and the genres that have come out of that, we would think of it as a duality of like romance and horror, I would say. Those are the two genres that were heavily influenced by the Gothic novel. So kind of Horace Walpole was saying like, what is Gothic? It's a duality of two things, like the medieval epic, the modern novel, and I'm trying to make them into one. And then if you think of the duality that came out of it, romance and horror were kind of the two genres that were influenced by this. So mostly horror now kind of clings to that Gothic edifice a lot. And the horror in this book will not scare a modern reader. There's a couple spooky instances where some ghosts show up. And there's like a skeleton and a cowl. And then, like I said, there's the aforementioned giant armor. So a lot of the things that Horace Walpole introduces in this book is like, the brooding, evil Gothic lord with some kind of insidious plan for the young maiden. The young maiden who's constantly fading or trying to, have an escape or something. Subterranean passages and secret rooms and secret tunnels and such. You have the ruined castle. You have the church abbey. You have mysterious turns of events, ghosts and things like that. You have a skeleton. Always love to see a good skeleton in a story. We also have kind of like the usurper, which will come up in a lot. Like someone has wrongly stolen someone else's claim to a certain castle or title or such and such. And then you have like the virtuous youth who's like, oh, he's so good. It's like, oh, it turns out because he's not really a peasant, he's like a lord. All of that is in here, and it all becomes kind of stock tropes later on in Gothic fiction and like romantic, sentimental novels like that. But it was all kind of very fresher when this was written 250 years ago. So you've got to kind of take it with a grain of salt. But if you read it now, it's not going to be that like thrilling of a book. Some people have said that they had problems reading the book. I don't think that most modern readers would have much of a problem with the book. The biggest problem, I would say, is that grammatically, and I saw this on some other people's reviews, there's no quotes. So when people say things, the dialogue is in line and just kind of continues. So for modern readers, that's not the way that dialogue is spaced, and it's not the way that dialogue is like presented without quotations. So that could be a little bit difficult because of the inline dialogue. Other than that, I think that it's pretty easy to read for a modern reader. I mean, if you're used to like reading something like from Jane Austen's time, I don't think that there's a huge difference from like 1820s to 1760s. Even I read something like Voltaire, which was written kind of around the same time as this. The language is pretty easy. It's a lot easier than Shakespeare. It's a lot more modern than Shakespeare. So I wouldn't think that you would have a problem reading it like that. It's not going to thrill you. It's not going to chill you. I would say it's more of like an academic exercise. If you really like old, like romantic stories, Gothic horror stories, this is like very interesting in that it's like the origin of the Gothic genre. And for that, it's like a curiosity read. But honestly, even if you were looking to like read some old books from the 1700s, there's much better ones that come after this than the Castle of Otranto. The Castle of Otranto is really innovative, but it's not going to be terribly fascinating unless you are super into figuring out like the origins of genres and like tracing it. Now, it is worth a read because honestly, in this version, the story is like 112 pages. And in other versions, I think that it's less than 100. So you can read this like really quickly. You can read this in a day, like easily, and blow through it. And a lot of people, I think, have read this like in university. It's very short. It's a very quick read. The action and the pacing moves along fairly quickly. But like I said, it's not going to like revolutionize your world or anything like that. The plot, you don't even really need to know the plot. Like I said, you can read this thing in a day. and it's some pretty stock stuff now that became like the basis of the genre. So there's a Lord Manfred, and he's going to marry off his son Conrad. So Conrad has this beautiful virgin, Isabella, who's been betrothed to him for years. And finally they've come of age and they're going to get married. And then in the first page, like, Conrad gets killed. A mysterious, aforementioned giant helm comes from the sky and crushes him on his wedding day. Oh no. Conrad, you were in the story for a very short time, buddy. You were gone. The book after this delves into like some real like weird subplots. So Manfred, who's happily married and has 2 children and is old enough to be Isabella's father, and indeed was about to be her father-in-law in a couple hours until his son was mysteriously killed by a gigantic helmet, almost immediately forgets all about his favorite child, Conrad. In fact, he starts kind of talking crap about Conrad almost as soon as he's dead, and has decided he's going to marry Isabella. Of course, he's got to get a divorce for that because he's already married, and like she really doesn't want to marry him because it's literally like her father-in-law, and he's acted like a father towards her, but now it's like weird pseudo like incestuous. And so like now she has to try and escape from his evil plans, and then all kinds of weirdness happens. Secretly, there's another heir to the castle, and like there's her family that's gonna like come rescue her, and there's a priest that gets involved, and then there's like the will they won't they of whether Manfred is gonna divorce his wife Hippolyta. There's sub-stories with the daughter, Matilda, and she's in love with this guy who shows up, Theodore. And then there's weird subplots like with servants running around being chased by like giant armor, and there's skeletons and ghosts aforementioned, and secret passageways and things with the church, and priest tries to help them out, and then he has a secret, and then there's another secret passage, and then everybody has a secret. Just everybody has a secret. You know, nobody's who you think they are, and there's all this whole huge backstory, and then at the end it all just gets resolved. That's my short breakdown of the plot. Following these plots is kind of ridiculous. Castle of Otranto is no different. It has a ridiculous plot. It's a ridiculous kind of book if you don't get into it. If you get into it and follow the story, it's fun. There's a romance, there's an adventure, there's some skeletons and a giant coat of armor. It's a little bit fun like that. It's not gonna like give you nightmares. The spooky ghosts from the Castle of Otranto will have no effect on the modern reader's sensibilities, but it is really interesting. So, it's a cheap book. You can find a cheap copy of this anywhere. It's short. It's a one-day read. If you're really into the Gothic, you should like read this, because then you can say you read the first ever Gothic novel. If you're not really into the Gothic, don't bother. Read something else. It really is a curiosity for people who are interested in the origins of the genre, or who are really into these things. Not probably for most readers nowadays. I'm actually going to talk more about the Castle of Otranto in upcoming videos, so I'm not going to overdo it on this one. I'm going to say thank you guys. Like and subscribe if you want to hear more about early Gothic novels. I'm going to follow up with the second Gothic novel and my review of that coming right up. So thank you guys for watching. Like, subscribe, comment, all those things. And I appreciate everyone that has already. See you soon.